Welcome to Mapping the Self. I'm Selena Garofino. Know thyself was carved into stone at the entrance of Apollo's temple at Delphi in ancient Greece. Scholars, poets, philosophers have debated the big questions around what it is to know yourself for thousands of years. I invite you to join me for conversations with artists, creators, scholars, spiritual teachers, writers, and humans of all walks of life to discuss these big questions together, to engage in a dialogue around what it is to live fully, to map ourselves, to know ourselves, to grow our compassion and listening, and to explore together our highest possibilities. Welcome. This episode of Mapping the Self is really special to me. It's an interview with Octavia Raheem, the author of Pause, Rest, Be, and Gather. She's a rest coach. She's a luminary. She's an elder. She's a future ancestor of just the highest order. And I was so nervous getting on the call to speak with her, which is not something I normally have experienced when I've been interviewing or meeting people. I think it's because her work so profoundly has touched me in the last year and a half as I've been navigating some really difficult circumstances in my body. And after 41 years, finally recognizing how much I overwork, how much, even though people tell me all the time to slow down, how difficult that seems. And in the moments when I felt like it was impossible to rest, because if I don't do this thing or this thing, the world's going to fall apart or my needs won't be met. I have to work all these hours. I have to get through graduate school with the best grades and at the expense of anything, at the expense of my body, my health, my well-being. And which is so funny as a yoga teacher, a breath teacher, a meditation teacher, and someone who deeply engages with those practices and yet couldn't rest. It's been this endless journey of thinking I wouldn't have been able to articulate it at the time, but when I was young, that through my yoga practice and whatnot, I was disciplining myself into worthiness and goodness. And I think a lot of practitioners I've spoken with over the years have subconsciously been doing the same thing. Rather than engaging with the practice from a place of love, we've been doing it maybe for love. And I'm still navigating learning to rest. All this to say, I got very nervous when I had to speak with Octavia. And the first couple minutes of the call before the recording even started, she already had me in tears with her grace, the grace that was just pouring off of her tongue. And when the episode started, I was so nervous. I was just chattering away. And then we paused at her suggestion when I said, I don't even know how to begin. And she said, let's just pause. And I'll let you tune into that in a moment and that experience for yourself. When in the middle of the call, her landscaper was outside of her window and the sound got really loud and we paused the recording, as you'll hear, and restarted it. So you might notice a little lapse in the recording and it restarts at sort of an interesting place. We kind of restarted the conversation. And in that 10 minutes or so that we were not recording, I was just in tears. She asked me a couple questions and we were speaking about some circumstances of our lives and circumstances of the world. And I was apologizing for crying, for weeping and saying like, I'll get it together before we restart the interview. And I'm very much paraphrasing, but she basically said, why would you get it together? Your tears are exactly the right thing for this moment in history, this moment in time, with everything happening in the world, with the things happening personally, with the pain. Tears are the most natural thing in the world. They're exactly the right thing. And we're going to show up just like this. And it was so profound for me. And so I just wanted to share that with you. Whatever you're going through, however you're feeling, your tears are appropriate. Your anger might be very appropriate. And we're going to show up just like this. And you are welcome here in whatever state you're in. And I really hope that this episode serves you. So welcome and enjoy the show. Welcome to Mapping the Self. I am really excited today and honored to have Octavia Raheem on the show. She is a mother and yoga teacher, but I would like to highlight that she is an author and a really stunning writer. And I say that because the intro to her book, Gather, she writes so beautifully about reclaiming her little girl self that dreamed of being a writer And if you haven't read her 2 books, Pause, Rest, Be, and Gather, I encourage you to, as soon as you're done listening, go add them to your cart and bring them into your life. Thank you so much for being here, Octavia.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's really such a gift. I have so many questions for you. Your book came to me at a really interesting time. I identify very much with the early chapters you wrote in Pause, Rest, Be about being someone that was overworked and tapped out. I've operated that way, I think, my entire life. My parents have been asking me to slow down since I was 4 years old. And I felt I had this compelling drive to own my space in the world through my doing, like a deep-seated belief that I don't know where it came from, that maybe it's just from our culture, that in order to have a right to exist here, I had to prove my value every single day. On Christmas of 2021, my mom gave me this book called Towards Rest, Discovering the Qualities of Rest for Our Lives of Faith. And I sort of, and she was like begging me to rest again. And I kind of shoved it under the bed. And then through some circumstances of falling ill and having some really severe injuries, your book was sent to me. And it's literally the thing that I carry around with me as I'm navigating learning to rest. So I thank you for this offering in the world. I just don't even know where to begin. There's so much here.
Well, I can offer something.
Please.
Let us start by stopping. And what that means for me is we start by noticing our body in the space, wherever we are or listening. And then we can just sit and take 3 to 5 breaths together. And I trust that by starting by stopping, the most resonant and appropriate next move arrives organically. So let's just take 3 to 5 breaths.
Mm. Thank you.
So one way I invite people to rest with Pause, Rest, Be, my second book, is to do what we just did. Start by stopping, pause, connect to body, breath, self, right? And the other, or the other person if you're with someone. And then if you're holding Pause, Rest, Be, just to ask the simple question, what message might I need right now? Give me a message, right? That's useful for my path or my place or my day, for whatever lies ahead. And I just did that for us. And I opened to page 68, which says, this is preparing you for what you asked for. Walking the road to your dream prepares you to arrive at it, to live it, to love it, to know how to greet it, to thrive within it. Page 69, which I can see both those pages, so I'm going to claim those as the message for us. Right now, the only light coming through is that of an intense fire, the fire of your rage. You do not have to simmer down. Do not burn yourself either. Look into the fire. What fuels it? And how can the light of it serve you in this dark place? How can the light of it serve you in this dark place? So maybe that resonates with you, or maybe that resonates with those who will hear this. But the primary message I came to share is to trust that we can start by stopping, and we can do that as many times as we need to, and to really invite people into the remembrance that the pause is a place of power. There are powerful movements that must be taken in this lifetime, but also the pause is a place of power.
I have both of those pages highlighted so many times. There's a big green circle around page 68 and a heart on the page.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I like that.
That was really, really lovely. One of the things I wanted to ask you about, and you just, you hold this message. You hold it in your body. I can feel it I don't even know where you are, but the minute you started speaking and you guided me into those breaths, there's a transmission there. Like this is something you own with the whole of who you are. And it's so profound and so beautiful. And I would love it if maybe you could speak to our listener and to me about how we lean into this when it feels like it's impossible. When you have the single mother that is trying to figure out how to work such long hours, or, all these circumstances we face that it can feel like if we stop, we won't survive. What do you have for that listener?
I have tremendous compassion for that person, for that listener. Because in having tremendous compassion for that person and listener, that's the compassion I have for myself. I don't teach about pausing, resting, and being because it came to me with ease, because I just knew how to do it. I teach it because I've had to be hospitalized at the edge of burnout and suffer greatly many, many times to finally surrender to the truth that rest was a birthright and not something I needed to earn. Practically speaking, though, I invite people to start with the pause that is available to them. And what I mean by that, as a teacher of restorative yoga and yoga nidra and yin and meditation, these practices of stillness that oftentimes might be 15, 20, 30 minutes, up to an hour, 90 minutes. If you are in this fight to survive, be that mentally, physically, emotionally, financially, socially, on some level, right? And you haven't been practicing rest, and you also don't know where to begin, or there's a lot of fear, or there's a really dysregulated nervous system, the place to start is where we did, with the first breath, then with the second breath, then with the third breath. That's a rest practice, and it's a worthy practice, and I believe it counts. What happens though is we have to find a way to remember to engage that pause.
Well, so, my friends, there's a little clip here because we had to pause. I just asked Octavia, what should we do? Do we just edit it together? And she laughed and said, well, we're practicing pausing, so let's acknowledge that. So I'm acknowledging the pause. We took a little pause and we're back.
Yes.
Octavia, you were speaking about compassion for the person that feels like it's impossible because of circumstances to rest. So I'm going to hand it back over to you.
Thank you. And we start with compassion for self, right? I would say followed by compassion. I was saying compassion, and then you practice the pause in whatever increment you have the capacity to. If you're like, I can pause for one breath, you pause for one breath and you allow that to count. You give yourself credit for that, because that's the kind of self-compassionate thing to do, is to give yourself credit for how you are turning toward your own care, how you are making space for yourself, even if you're stringing together small moments. We've been conditioned to think it has to be something massive or big, or we're not doing it. And I think the bravest thing one can do if they have some fear around resting and pausing, or it just doesn't feel accessible or available to them, is to acknowledge the moments where they do and say, that does count. I did it and it counts. The other thing is, I invite people into the curiosity. Why do I feel this way? But again, with a lot of softness, like, what is this? What is this resistance to the pause or to the rest? What is this fear of the pause or the rest? What is this for me really? And to hold what arises with the most tender embrace that they possibly can. Right. Because I think the curiosity will actually lead someone to the way to pause for them, the way to rest for them, which might be distinctly different from my way or your way. I also want to say, I do know that it's possible, right? I want to acknowledge, I'm acknowledging the both end. It can feel impossible, and I know it is possible. I have sat in my car when I used to have a day job and went into like a building, I've sat in my car and paused, you know, and said, and I probably didn't close my eyes because, you know, my anxiety was probably like, don't close your eyes. You're in a public place and sitting in your car. But just what I'm inviting people into is to notice where they are already practicing the pause or where there's a natural pause and they can acknowledge it. Acknowledging the pause is also a rest practice, I'm going to say. And then to start to extend compassion and grace to self, to expand on the pauses that already exist in their life when they remember to.
That's so good. That's so good because it's similar to how people think they can't do yoga or asana or exercise unless they have 30 minutes or 90 minutes. And it's a lie. A walk to your mailbox is exercise. Standing up and shaking your body and taking a deep breath. Any movement is good movement and is helpful. And to shame ourselves out of moving because we can't do it in some idealized way is such a interesting idea and roadblock we put on ourselves. And I think I've done the same thing with rest. I'm like, well, if I can't turn on a nidra practice, if I can't do a 30-minute restorative session, it doesn't count, like you said. So this is a really big aha for me too. Like every time we pause and just bring our attention to our breath, it counts as a rest practice we can expand upon. What a beautiful thing.
It counts, right? It counts. And I find it to be liberating. And I think it's important to acknowledge it. You know, this can seem really silly and cheesy, but to go, I did it. I did it. Like to acknowledge ourselves when we actually turn toward the self. And, you know, when my son was a newborn, which I'm going to say was in my mind was like up until he was 1 years old and able to walk. My son he needed to be held. I mean, he needed to be held. He loved being held and mostly by me. Right? I developed something that I learned was called mommy thumb that I didn't know about until I had my son from like picking him up and holding him so much. I developed this condition in my hands. But
Oh my
my point
gosh.
is, you know, and I remember thinking, how do I maintain my rigorous meditation and yoga nidra and my practices when I'm sitting holding this kid? You know, I really had this thought. And I have this picture that's one of my favorite pictures of me and him where I am holding him. I have this mudra symbol like in my embrace of him. And I can look at that picture and remember that was the moment that I said to myself, well, this is your practice looks different now. And then you hold him and you find a new way to practice. And so I would hold my son and, you know, hold on to him. And instead of closing my eyes, because I was holding someone precious, I didn't want to close my eyes and sink too far in. I would soften my gaze and just turn to my breath, you know, pay attention to my belly rising and falling. And sometimes I'd set a timer and be like, I'm going to do that for 5 minutes because that's about as much attention as I can hold in this moment. And that became my practice. And then the other thing I did in that moment for myself is I had an audio recording of a nidra or a deep relaxation that was 10 to 15 minutes. And when he would go down for a nap and I would slowly place him down and I was like, okay, he's going to stay. I would sit in a chair and listen to that versus laying all the way down because I felt like some part of me was on high alert, you know? And so I gave myself permission for my practice to evolve as to meet the life I was actually living, not some idealized life in my mind. And it continues to evolve, you know,
Right.
It's like life and responsibilities and people grow up and not every rest practice do I do with my family or my child. And I do sometimes leave the door open. I do sometimes sit in the middle of the chaos of his Legos and meditate, you know, like for me, I love
That's
the
a
mat
metaphor for
practice.
life, isn't it?
Right. I love the sit on my cushion, lay in my rest nest practices. I need those. And at some point we want to cultivate those. And think it's so important to honor the life that we are living and to meet the practice in that way. And to
I'm
also not
so
be,
glad you
because
said that.
I'm naming this because you also, you mentioned like the single mom, right?
Yeah.
And single parenthood, or the single parenting, and single parenthood is not my direct experience right now. I'm the daughter of a woman who raised two children alone. And I've been thinking about it so much because I ask people often, who taught you about resting? Because we have a lot of people in our life usually that we can point to and say, that person taught me about what it means to work, right? You know, like at every institution and environment we go into, we're learning something about how to work. But the truth is, in learning and receiving messages about working, we're also receiving messages about resting, even if
Right.
they're minimal, right? But I've been thinking because I ask that question so much when I'm teaching and guiding people, well, who taught you about rest? And I'm like, my solo parenting mother did teach me something about rest that was more direct than I've been giving credit to. And she had an extensive prayer practice.
Yeah.
You know, she knew how and when to close her door and dare us to open it. Right?
Right.
You know, she had us have quiet time. Like, there are ways that I'm like, she probably wouldn't have used the language of rest practice, but she was weaving into her life and our lives to the best of her ability this idea of the sacred taking space. And even with I'm going to close the door now, her setting a boundary for herself as not only a mother and a caretaker and all of this, but like as a woman in need of space and time to herself, and so the other thing, and I'll wrap up this question, is because we're going to start with self-compassion, which that is maybe a lifetime practice, right? To really be more soft and gentle, kind and caring to ourselves versus berate ourselves for what we're not doing and how we can't figure it out and we just can't get it right this time. We start with the self-compassion. We have some curiosity about, well, what am I afraid of? What am I concerned about? What are the actual obstacles in the way to me resting? How can I, moment by moment, choice by choice, clear up one or two of those? We also want to go to the place where we acknowledge the ways we are caring for ourselves, the ways that we do access the pause, right? Even like, the other thing I keep saying is like, let it count, like count yourself in, like count your practice. And then ultimately we arrive at the place where if what we have is space and opportunity to acknowledge this breath, then the next breath, then the next breath, we do that and we go, I did it.
Yeah.
I did it, and I'm like, that's where I would say start the practice.
Yeah.
And then there are so many places that we can go, but the portal into rest, deeper rest, is the portal starts with the gateway or threshold of what is your relationship with the pause, and can you cultivate that in your everyday life?
And you're speaking to something so important, which is that we don't serve the practice, whatever practice it is. It's to serve our life. Like, we're not doing things to get good at them. They're to make our life more joyful and present and loving and compassionate. And when we make rest another to do and another stress thing, that's a bit counterproductive. And like you said, we tend to berate ourselves for what we don't do instead of celebrating the little ways we are already practicing. And I love what you spoke about for motherhood. The reason I'd mentioned motherhood is I have a lot of friends and students who have young children right now. One of them has a military spouse, so she's essentially acting as a single mother with two toddlers. And, she's been posting recently Instagram stories just like, I don't know what to do. I have no body autonomy. And what you just spoke to, like, I can't wait for her to hear about you and your son and the mudra in your hand, because that, she loves holding her children. It's not that she doesn't love holding her children, but trying to figure out how to cultivate a relationship to practice still without that same body autonomy that you had before you had an infant. So I think it's beautiful you shared that.
It's really real. And the other thing is like, we often are living and creating and trying our best without the kind of essential social and communal systems that we need. Right. And beyond that, even if you have like this kind of nuclear family of maybe two adults and maybe one or two kids and a dog, I'm like, with the fabric of our humanity is we need far more connection and support in the web of village, having so many gaps in it, make it even that more challenging for us to figure out like, well, how can I be? Like, how can I be when a lot of people are essentially doing what would have been held or holding what would have been held by so many other hands? I mean, in this country, we're so removed. We're probably hundreds of years removed from that kind of reality. But I say all that to be like, I hold that tenderly, and then we get really curious and really inventive and really creative about how to find a way, like how to find a way, even as we realize all of that. The other thing I'm hearing is there's so much power in saying, I need help, even if we're saying that aloud and there's no one there to hear it.
I just felt that in my whole body. I just started crying again.
Yeah, well, because I said it because I heard that I should say it, that I should say that there's a lot of dysfunction, there's a lot of loss, there's a lot of longing, there's a lot that everyone's holding. And a lot of times we don't know how to ask for help. Like it can feel like a sign of weakness. It can feel like, well, what help is not even going to come. So why ask? I'm the one that's always helping. Who's going to actually help me? And I'm naming things that I'm like, I've had every single one of those thoughts. Some of it was true. There's the worst feeling when you gather all your courage to say, I need help, and everyone turns away from you, or it feels like there's no one to hold you. Yet the deeper truth is you are held by many unseen hands, right? And so I also said, saying I need help aloud, even when you're like, there's no one here to hear me.
Yeah.
And it's regardless of faith. And this is one of my practices. I like sometimes when I'm laying in bed, thinking about recently with everything that happened in Nashville, I've been laying in bed, thinking about the children of our country and our world, and thinking about the level of violence that we endure and that they have witnessed in their short lifespans. And things don't usually keep me up at night. Things related to children and violence and the loss of their lives really keep me up. And as I've been laying in bed at night, listening out for my child sleeping and breathing and continuing to live, and thinking about the horrendous ways that we are losing our children, that last night I sat up and I just said, my God, I need help. And then I said, we need help. And who was listening? No human ear. I really do trust that something more grand, benevolent, and vast than a human ear was definitely hearing me. So I also want to offer that to people who are like, I feel so stuck. I don't actually, where do you actually start? You might just say, I need help.
Yeah.
Out loud, and let those words be the prayer.
Right. And sometimes you don't feel or notice the generosity of that holding until so much later. Like when Octavia and I were paused and you couldn't hear us, it wasn't being recorded. I was telling her about when I lost my spouse. And I say I lost him because he has a severe traumatic brain injury and is in an institution. But during that time period when I was caregiving for him, and so wildly unprepared to do that, our country does not have good medical care. And because there was a lapse in our insurance, he was sent home out of the rehab center before he should have been. So, I was 32 years old and in my apartment, a PhD student trying to work and teach and caregive for someone with a severe TBI that I had no knowledge or capacity of how to cope with that. And someone who eventually became quite violent. And there was so many days in the course of that 2 years that I was on the bathroom floor because it was the only place I could get away, slid down the wall in a puddle of tears, crying out to God and for help. And I couldn't see in the moment, I felt so abandoned and alone. But when I look back now with the redemptive eyes I have in this moment, I can see the generosity of how I was held. And now when I'm in those same moments and I'm crying out for help and it feels like there's no one to say it to and it's an unseen ear, I can look back and at least hold that knowing of I was held last time. I
That's
couldn't
right.
feel it in the moment, but I was held.
And I will be held. So I need help is a complete prayer. And, the memory, maybe just repeating to the self, I am held, even through this, especially through this.
Yeah, it's with everything in our world. It's like, how do we keep one eye on the sort of facts of the matter and another eye on these compassion practices and on, for me, a belief that there is also an inherent goodness and that we can be pillars and beacons of that goodness and also not to turn away. Like we can't turn away from these things that are happening. Maybe you could speak to that for a moment. You already have, but like, how do we hold one eye on the goodness and on the compassion and on the kindness while also being willing to not look away from the things that in the world that do need our attention?
Well, I would say it is called the practice of the both ands. These rest practices that I teach and you teach and your listeners may practice beyond the pause, like restorative yoga, meditation, yoga nidra, yin yoga. They also support us in regulating our nervous systems. And one of the greatest gifts we can give ourselves and each other is to be a regulated nervous system in a world of dysregulation and chaos, right? And so I do treat my practice as a way to tend to the garden and collect the garden of the collective, right? To use that metaphor of tending to the garden on behalf of us all. And also, I'm no somatic therapist, and I'm sure there are those who could really, really break down the nervous system and how we involuntarily are responding to one another's systems. But what I do know about that has really transformed the way I think about the power and importance of my individual practice to impact change. I need to be, we all do have the light and goodness within us. And for me, I hold myself accountable and deeply responsible for doing and acting and practicing in ways that cultivate that and allow my light to be brought forward. And part of that is actually attending to my shadow and tending to my darkness and honoring my own grief and my own pain and my own suffering. And so for me, centering my practice, and sometimes that looks like 10 minutes in the morning, right? But doing the things that support my regulation versus dysregulation allows me to show up with a lot more tenderness, pure presence, and clarity to the chaos, the challenges, to the pain, and to the suffering. And it also lets me to stay awake enough to know when I'm at my own capacity. And the best thing I can do is actually, for now, I actually need to close both eyes. So it's like they're awake to myself and to what's actually happening and to when I need to hold me and when I need to hold others. And there's this dynamic at play, right? Like I have no desire to sit in a room with my eyes closed all day. And I also know that sitting in a room with my eyes closed for 5-10 minutes, or even sitting in the midst of those Legos with my son in his own little world of chaos, like having a way to pull back from the constant onslaught to a place of the pause to access more of my light and power then helps me to step forward in the world in a more meaningful, grace-filled, present, authentic, and healed way. The other thing, though, is that never in the history of humanity have we been able to be bombarded, our nervous systems, our beings been able to be so bombarded by so much dissonant information. And what I mean by that is like, at some point in time, the most we might know is what's going on in such deep intimacy is what's going on in our neighborhood, right? So our systems were like, oh, this happened to Miss Ruth Ann down the street and they're enduring this trauma and tragedy. And here's how we are going to show up for that. There's good and not good to how kind of globally connected we can be through all these digital means. And what I'm also aware of is there's this way that when in history have you been able to open a device, scroll for 5 minutes, and learn of 50 horrendous things that just happened?
Exactly.
And so for me, I also invite people to redefine like what's closing, what's turning away. I think deciding that you're not going to spend 2 hours in the digital vortex, right? Consuming what dysregulates you. That's not turning away. That's just honoring that you have a human nervous system, right?
Yes.
So in short, it's like I honor my practice, and part of my practice is to support me in being a grounded and stabilized force in a shaky world. And part of that also means that I take my practice. My practice doesn't just live on the mat where I don't have anything that kind of pokes at me.
Right.
Right. So I'm not trying to avoid or activates. Activates is the word.
Yes,
so
the
both
training
end.
ground.
Yes, like the both end. I think honoring the both ends.
If you are enjoying these conversations and you're ready to deepen your engagement, I invite you to visit my website where you will find a host of instant access courses, information about 200, 300, and 500-hour yoga teacher trainings and continuing education, and invitations to retreat with me. These transformational retreats are anchored in the old stories, somatic movement, ritual, and contemplative practices in the ongoing ceremony we call living. I also offer one-on-one and group coaching to guide you home to your inner wisdom and to live the story you want to be told. I hope to see you in class. Additionally, there are a host of free classes on my YouTube channel, which is just my name, Selena Garofino. I hope to see you on the mat or at the fireside for some engaged storytelling. Thank you again for being here. So much wisdom there, like not overly engaging with, I speak about this a lot as well because I'm an anthropologist, so I'm very familiar with the rapid changes that have come into what we call the Anthropocene, this era that is dominated by mankind. And we're bombarded with so much information, and it's our job to choose what's coming through the gate of the senses and not to turn away and deny reality. We need to be aware, and these mass shootings and the violence, there's things we need to be fighting for injustice and for those who are voiceless. And we can't do that if we're in empathetic distress because we're not caring for ourselves. I'm in school for somatic experiencing, the professional therapy training. And
beautiful.
I'm taking a class right now with Steve. I'm going to probably butcher his name, so I apologize, listener. Stephen Porges, who is the, founder of polyvagal theory. And that term gets thrown around a lot now and kind of misused. It's really a theory of why we're social animals. And so you've spoken to something really important, because when we are self-regulated, we can then pull others into regulation with us through that eye to eye, through that moment of being eye to eye with one another through that. He was saying in the last lecture, I'm putting it in spiritual terms now, but the literal resonance and energy in our body, even if you're saying the right words and in the right tone of voice, if your body is deregulated, the people around you can feel it and will also be kind of pulled. And so it's a very real thing. We talk about it about ourselves all the time in the wellness world now, again, because it's a little misunderstood, but it's actually a social nerve. And so what you're speaking of is so critical because, those pauses, doing the nidra practices, tending to our nervous systems is what allows us to show up as a grounding force, as a parent, as a leader in our home, whatever your sphere of influence is. And it can't be understated.
That's right. That's beautiful. I love that.
So cool, right? Yeah, the somatic piece is big for me. It's really where I'm going. And it's interesting because I know you've spoken about and I'm, to be very clear, I'm not disparaging the power classes or whatever. We all need different things in our bodies. But I spent so much of my yoga life, I started practicing when I was 12 and I'm 41 now. And I realize now, looking back, as I'm navigating a really serious injury the last couple of years, how much of my practice was about correction for so many years. And I wouldn't have been able to articulate that to anyone because I thought I was being, but I was correcting. I was always fixing something that was wrong in me, in my body, in my feelings. It was all about fixing.
Yeah. You don't know until you know. I often say how I was misusing my asana practice was to control and manipulate my body.
Yes.
And to fix, like you said, versus befriend. I didn't know how to be a friend to myself. Because, I had deeply internalized that myself was wrong. I don't want to be a friend with that, and for me, it was my first experience with meditation that stuck was 2005. It's 2005. One of my teachers, grandfather, taught me transcendental meditation. And I had tried so many kinds of meditation and they just did not stick, and I'm like, wow, the pure simplicity of this. Okay. and I still practice that way. Now I have different layers of meditation I practice with, but my home practice is still that practice he gave me in 2005. And it was that stillness in that practice that started to awaken me to the carelessness which I was being with myself. And it was actually challenging because the stillness, when I started practicing the stillness piece of yoga, I started to have a lot more inner friction around the way I was being with myself in my physical practice. Right. Because I was still resisting seeing what I was actually doing to myself. Right. But I have to say the stillness or the meditation practice helped me gain the capacity for the gigantic evolution of how I practiced that was upon me because I was so dependent on my physical practice. Those endorphins are real, but I was not being kind to myself. Right. And for me, it was a slow evolution I would have practiced physical yoga 90 minutes a day, on the weekends, 3 hours,
Same.
And I really thought if I could just get this just right, then I won't have to deal with my interior. I didn't know that until I knew it. And the way I started to know.
No, because you think you are tending to your interior when you're doing that. At the time, you really believe you're tending to your interior that way.
Yeah. And it's a gateway, right? I am forever grateful for the physical practice and the portal that it was to me. But I also, there's a part of my spiritual heritage is Christianity. And one of my favorite verses is Psalms 46:10, which is be still and know. And it really is my truth that it was when I started to practice stillness. And it was in small doses, but it immediately revealed where I was out of alignment, how I was not in relationship with myself, and how I was using my physical practice to essentially numb out, to not feel, to bypass true healing. And I don't think that's what everyone is doing. That's definitely what Octavia Raheem was doing,
that's what I was doing too.
A real, yeah, and so.
It was from a pure place, though. It was from a desire to evolve and to grow and, but just, we had to do that.
And now I have a much more joyful and harmonious relationship with movement in my body, and the asana practice is so much more freeing and fun, and I
Well, there's
still,
not corrective pressure in it anymore. There's
yeah,
not like, you don't
yeah,
need to come out of it, completely transformed or having, now it's an experience of this vibrancy of flesh through which, Spirit of God or whatever language people want to use is residing. And now it's like
yeah.
a place to dance with that. And I would love it if you could speak for a second, because you touched on something. I know when I first started doing stillness practices, and Roshi Joan Halifax articulates this really well. I'm going to paraphrase, but she says, when you get still and quiet, your conditioning gets very loud. And you mentioned that kind of frictive thing that happens when you first start being still. And I think it can be really scary for people, that interoceptive space, because interoception, for our listeners, your awareness of your interior. And if you are anxious and you get quiet, now you're anxious and you're aware of how anxious you are. And so it can feel very scary in there. So do you have anything for our listener about those early days of approaching stillness and how frictive that can feel?
That statement you just said, it can feel very scary in there. And I think I just thought about how we can be afraid of what is an unknown, and it feels so wild to be like, the self can be an unknown to the self, right? So just that, what you just said is really profound to me. So what I can say is, the asana practice, the movement is really a beautiful precursor if we have a skilled teacher, or we have the awareness to go, let me move and then be still, right? I think part of what can soften that is really scary in here is you have moved, but that's not what I was doing. So I want to, I know that can sound confusing. I'm like, that's not what I was doing. I would do all the movements and then Shavasana for 1 minute and be completely irritated by that 1 minute. Right?
Or fall asleep because you had just done 90 minutes of hot power yoga.
And so but for me now, if there's this activated state and I'm like, ooh, trying to sit with this and forced sitting in the stillness in this high level of activation, I might go for a short walk. I got this from one of my teachers, Shanti Takarante Perez, and just shaking. And so that's just to say, the person who is leaning toward perfectionism might sit, and no matter what comes up, they're going to force themselves to sit. They won't move. And I'm like, well, if there's a high level of activation, I get curious about it. And then what I'm hearing is, I need some movement. I need some shifting. I need some shaking. Then I do that. And then I come back to it. And the other thing is, so I also teach restorative yoga, where so much can come up in that kind of stillness. And I think when we're practicing in a community with that, and we have a skillful teacher and space holder, what I say then is, what comes up, and we had this conversation, you and I, when we were at the pause, what comes up? Can you just commit to being still one more breath? It might move through. If you are in deep discomfort, then you move. What I find, that place of revelation that comes up in stillness, and how you become aware. Now you're aware that you're anxious, or you're aware of, I was really not very kind and loving to myself when I got still. When I started to really practice stillness, that would come up in waves. And it wouldn't be the entire 10-minute sit. It would maybe come up at the beginning where it was really the strongest. And I also noticed if I could sit and be with that for 1 second more, my capacity grew. The intensity might not have changed, but my capacity grew. So the two things, I guess I'm saying 2 or 3 things, is you can move first, but let your movement be in service of your stillness.
I'm going to interrupt you there to help with that. There's a quote from Gabrielle Roth, the creator of 5 Rhythms, to shift from being the mover to being moved.
Yeah. Yes.
Carry on.
I love that. I love that quote, right? And engage, right? Or be engaged by movement. Let it be in service to descending into stillness, right? And then once you sit there, they're still like, oh my gosh, this is so hard. This is scary. I'm meeting someone anew, and that anew is me. One of my teachers, Dr. Gail Parker, She is the most extraordinary restorative yoga teacher I know. And a practice that she gives at the start of descending into stillness is to pause for maybe a moment or two, maybe a minute, just a minute, and ask yourself, how are you really? Okay. You could do this with your eyes open or closed. And then she'll talk a little bit more because it's so helpful to have like her voice to anchor to, you know. And then she goes, well, now ask yourself, what do you need from me? Not Dr. Parker or your teacher, but what do you actually need from me? But basically, she does all these things and she's like approaching this new space because it's actually new every time in some way with a air of friendliness.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Because I love what you said, right? You go in there and you're like, it's scary. But the fear is, what am I going to meet? But then the other thing, this is what prompted me to share these 3 inquiries that she offers at the very beginning of a stillness practice. The third one is the quality of curiosity, which is she'll invite you to ask, I wonder what might come up for me in this moment of stillness. I wonder what might come up for me in this pause or this rest. And for me, like I sometimes practice stillness where I don't do that in the beginning. It feels one way. And then when I go, well, actually, before I get all the way in, how are you, Octavia? What do you need from me? Because then when I ask the need question, then it might be like some movement, some water, keep a blanket on today, don't close your eyes, can we journal first? And actually listen.
Right.
And then, but this third question of I wonder what will come up for me, it always softens my shoulder. It's just like, can I approach this stillness, this moment of meeting myself who might have been cloaked in so much fatigue, exhaustion, and hiding? Can I approach it with an ounce more curiosity? That frees me up, right? That frees me up. And it also tells my brain, like, yeah, we might have a new experience today. And so then my brain is actually freed up from trying to maintain my kind of inner status quo and all of that stuff. And so that's what I would say.
Oh, I love that because one of my embodiment teachers, because I'm a somatic coach and now I'm doing this more formal training, but one of my teachers, Steve James, said that there's no informed consent on intimacy with yourself. Like when you sit down and close your eyes, it all comes up, whether you asked consent or not. But you actually just flipped that on its head because you just gave us a way to ask for consent. I don't like, yeah. I'm totally, my whole chest like opened up when you said that. I have like tingles up the back of my neck because even when I'm teaching embodiment, I'm like, well, it's true. There's no informed consent when you're talking about yourself, but you just gave us a way to offer consent. And that is going to be more nervous system containment. And I have to tell you, right as I just said that to you, a dove just landed on the tree branch outside my window.
Yeah. But that's Dr. Gail Parker. And that's a woman, with 40, 50 years of being a psychologist.
Yeah.
She's a yoga therapist.
I feel like we need to give her homage for a moment. Gail Parker, by the way, is the author of Restorative Yoga for Ethnic and Race-Based Stress and Trauma, among other things. And I strongly recommend you also seek her out. Well, we only have about 10 more minutes. I don't want to keep you too long. I try to keep them at an hour, and we've clipped our episode. And so there was a few minutes on the previous one. I don't want to take up all your time today. I could keep you here all day just listening to you. Your words are washing over me. Like, I'm going to use biblical terms, balm of Gilead. Like I hope, and I know it's going to be that way for our listener. I also grew up in that ancestry, and that other book that I mentioned that my mom gave to me is from that ancestry. And after then engaging with you, I did pick it back up, and there's something really beautiful in there I opened up to this morning that I think you might have something to share on as well. It says the furnace of transformation. As much as we may theoretically assent to our need for rest, we are emotionally unprepared to actually take our hand off the plow. In a society that values productivity above all else, our human worth has come to be defined by what we do. Who are we if we are not our work, our instant activity, and our accolades? When we do nothing, do we still matter? Rest functions as what the Dutch priest Henry Nouwen called the furnace of transformation. In the furnace, the false self built upon social expectations is exposed. Without the whirring of computers, the clicking of emails shot off rapid fire, and the ticking of to-do items running through our minds, we are left to face our own naked selves. It's no wonder we often avoid rest, but in the quiet as we reckon with what remains after our false selves have been exposed, God's word finally has a chance to break through.
Mm-hmm.
Rest in its fullest sense leads us back to the steadfastness of God.
Beautiful. What can I add to that?
I don't know. I was like, I bet you have thoughts about I feel like for me, I'm reading all your work. I'm practicing rest. I teach rest. And in some ways, I think the reason I'm called to teach restorative yoga is you probably can relate to this as a teacher. Often the things we're teaching, it's because we're also teaching ourselves. Like maybe your early days of rest teaching, or, now you are like fully the embodiment of it. But maybe your early days, you were a little more like me and still struggling with it while also speaking about it and offering it. It's so ingrained that we have to buy our place in the world. It's so ingrained. Like if have I earned my right to exist? I don't know how we break that thing over ourselves. Like it feels like an enchantment, to put it in fairy tale language. We're all in a trance that there's an enchantment that we have to earn our ability to love and exist.
Well, there is a trance, and what I'll say is that the practice chose me. And I teach to stay close to the hem of the garment of divine rest. I teach to stay close to the hem of the garment of divine rest. And that doesn't mean with perfection. That doesn't mean without challenge. Just like any relationship, worth its salt, we wake up every day. My husband and I were just talking about how we wake up every day and we renew our vow to each other. We renew the choice. And that's me in rest. But what is happening as I continue to rest in some way, shape, form, or fashion every day through formal practice or through informal practice. I wake up and I go, I will rest today. And that's just that on that. Right?
Yeah.
But then the day begins to unfold, and sometimes it go, it's like, well, when's that going to happen? But my vow to self, my devotion to self and the practice, right, is I'll find a way, right? And so that's not, and sometimes it's fitful. I'm moving. Sometimes it's the most glorious grace field. Sometimes, like it varies every practice, every day. So I just wanted to name that. It's not like I have necessarily figured something out that's not figure outable for anyone else. But what I have decided is the practice chose me and I choose it back. And I make that commitment. I devote to that again and again every day. Because I also know if I don't choose for myself, the world already has chosen some things for me that I don't want those. I rebuke that. And so, I rest with folks, and a lot at some point resistance to the rest, it always comes up. It shows up in a lot of different ways. And as we gain capacity and more awareness, the resistance becomes a little sneakier. Like the things that get in the way of rest have to become sneakier when we become more astute to basically the shit of it, right? And a question I ask is I invite people to go, well, what am I resisting when I resist rest? And then there'll be one answer, and then go, no, really, what am I resisting? Then there'll be another answer. And I invite people to do that practice because initially I had a lot of fight with resting. And it was like, Octavia 1, rest 0. Like I'm fighting with rest. And I'm a very disciplined person, meaning I can make myself do just about anything, but something about discipline wasn't actually moving me to a consistent practice. I had to connect to a sense of sacredness, and I had to, what is devotion? I had to just be like, what does it mean to be devoted to this practice? And part of that devotion was to invite my resistance to lay down with me. I couldn't push the resistance away. Like I had to go, resistance, maybe just come sit over here, right? Versus me being like, you. But when I started to ask my resistance, hey, what am I resisting? Then I asked that answer, well, what are you resisting? I had this conversation with my resistance. It took a few months, but one day I'm doing this, laying down and going, what am I actually resisting when I'm resisting rest? What am I resisting? I hear as clear as I'm speaking to you. When I resist rest, I'm resisting God.
Yeah.
That's my answer. I did this with a student and she came to, when I resist rest, I'm resisting true healing, right? And then you go, well, why on earth would I resist healing? Why would I resist God? Someone told me when I'm resisting rest, I'm resisting love. So well, why would you be resisting that? Well, to surrender to God, to surrender to healing, to surrender to real love means a whole bunch of shit's about to change. Right. So it's surrendering then to the transformation, that the awakening that comes through rest. And so, but when I had that language, when I realized that for me, my resisting rest was like trying to avoid God. And then another way I started to understand that is the radiance of my own divinity. I hold in tenderness like all of the experience, all of the conditioning, all of the oppression, all of the racism, sexism, poverty, all the things I've endured that taught me that I was not divine, that I was not worthy, and how much I really bought into that. And avoiding rest was just me co-signing that I wasn't worthy, right? But it also let me continue to fit into this paradigm that I was like, well, I want to belong someplace, and so all of that, I don't know if that makes complete sense, but
I think it was very well articulated.
Yeah. For me, I just got deeply curious about what am I resisting when I resist rest? My answer was I'm resisting God. So I really resonate with that excerpt you just read from that book. And the practice is the remedy, right? Like that. And again, where we started was, but I don't have time to practice, or I have fears around practice. You start where you can start. That is the remedy.
On the bottom of that page, we're just getting biblical today. It says, Psalms 3:5, I lay down and slept, yet I woke up in safety, for the Lord was watching over me.
That's right. Amen. Right. That's it.
I know we have to wrap up, so I don't want to open up a giant can of worms, but I feel like, especially as a white woman, I can't end a podcast with a Black woman talking about rest and not acknowledge the systemic racism and oppression and white supremacy that is anchored in all of our inability to rest, and the liberation that is needed for all beings. And if you have anything you want to say about that, I feel like it's really important. Like there's a lot of us, like even me, teaching rest and stuff. And I feel I'm being led by Black women, by Gail Parker and you and the NAP ministry. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that. And if there's just anything you want to say about any of that, I'm still stumbling through my own anti-racism work. It's messy, for all of us. And I just want to acknowledge you.
Thank you. I think my pause is the acknowledgement. Because I think there's something you said that the pause gives space for the listener to not just hear it, but to let it move through them. Like, what does that mean for you? How might they process what you just said? And I will just say, I think it's really beautiful if rest is a movement and stillness is a movement. Some of the teachers with the most fiercely quiet, I'm going to say, because loud doesn't feel appropriate, but fiercely resonant voices are Black women. Because as the writer and anthropologist Zora Neale Hurston said, like, we've been treated as the mules of the world, and the work, like these workhorses. And I know for us, it's like this deeper reclamation happening. And it's also essential for then, if people are learning from Black women in this movement are being deeply inspired for. Like every single time they teach on it, they need to name that. You need to name that. If it's Tricia, you need to name her in the NAP ministry. If it's Tracy Stanley, you need to name her, because so much, like Black women in general, we get erased and silenced from many of the movements, right? And so
Tracy Stanley's coming on soon, by the way. She's coming the end of the summer.
Yes, she's my teacher, my sister, my
We
friend.
both studied Yoga Nidra under Rod Stryker, but then the way in which Tracy brings it forth is another level. Right. It's another level.
It's something else, right? It's something else. And, and I know in kind of movement land and activist land and social justice land, so much has been tried by way of strategy, by way of organizing, by way of building, by way of rebuilding, by way of deconstructing. What I don't believe has been tried with devotion and consistency is healing. And healing can mean really a lot of different things. I know that trying healing is actually what's going to set this world right. And rest regulates. And Einstein, I think, said, you can't solve a problem from the same vibrational frequency that created the problem. And a lot of what's happening is we're trying to generate solution from a place that's dysregulated and deeply wounded and unhealed. And I'm not saying you got to stop everything to heal. I'm like, every movement should have healing paralleling it. And in this healing movement called rest, I am just delighted to have my offering be in the number, my voice to be in the number, and to be surrounded by the symphony of really brilliant Black women whose voices are lifting the sound of rest up to its rightful place in movement transformation and healing. And I'm also grateful to everyone who hears this message, allows themselves to be moved by it, right? Even when it creates friction, and thus begins their path of study on the transformational power of rest. So I'm grateful for you and your podcast. I'm grateful for your work and your healing in the world.
You're really an elder in this movement. You and Tracy Stanley and all the women you mentioned, like, we're becoming the elders that we seek. And the three of you, the names you just mentioned, and Gil Parker, and like, these are the elders of this. You're elders of this generation, and you're breathing forth the ancestral wisdom. And it is so important to name it. One of my teachers, Dr. Martin Shaw, he always says, like, and he's not talking about shame the way we talk about shame in the modern world, but he's like, never lose your sense of shame, because without it, you'll lift the ideas of other people and place them in your mouth and act like you've been touched by the genius of God, instead of acknowledging the giants upon whom you stand. And so we need to acknowledge the Black women that have really are pioneering this movement and this healing and the liberation work that we all need. And I don't remember who I heard it from, so I can't cite it properly, but we have to liberate everyone. We live under some delusion if we think we're liberated while there's Black people living under oppression or sexism or the LGBT community. Like, we are not free until we're all free. And so I just want to acknowledge you as we close out. I mean, I could keep you here all day, but I won't, because you have things to do and rest to do. I'm like, okay, we're at an hour. I feel the pressure. I have to wrap this up. I'll save my questions for another visit if I can have you back at some point. I still have like this whole page. I'm like, and there's quotes from your book I wanted to read. I'm like, oh, I didn't read all these beautiful quotes. You'll have to buy her book. That's the thing.
I think that it unfolded organically and as it needed to. And it might be, I don't know if this It's correct. So one of your listeners might check us that none of us is free and to all of us is free. It might be Nelson Mandela, believe
That seems accurate. I'm usually pretty good about remembering exactly who said what. I have a semi photographic memory for texts I've read, and I can pull quotes to mind really easily. But every once in a while, I'm like, oh shoot, who said that?
No, I have this too, and then saying like I'm like a daughter of hip hop, and so like sometimes I'll be like, was that?
Yeah, and
was that Biggie Smalls? Where did I get that from? Like,
right, and you have to be so careful because you're writing, and like I'm an academic. You know, I was an academic. I was a professor. I'm very much about citations. You know, like giving credit where it's due. And sometimes I'm like, I feel like these are not my words, but I don't know where they came from, and so then I'm like influenced by the unknown.
I know. It's so many layers to it.
Right. And some things are just in the collective consciousness, right? And so someone's like, oh, I read that somewhere else. And you're like, cool, but I didn't take it from them. It's just in collective consciousness. I just want to close with actually from your book, page 29 in Gather, because you were just talking about, we can't carry on the way that we were, or maybe you want to read it. I don't know if you have your book in front of you, but I have your book in front of me. When I opened it up this morning, the We Are Magic page, which is 28, and the commentary on the back of it, you wrote, daughter, the tools that aided our survival ain't always the same tools to thrive with. Open the locks, release the chains. You are meant to thrive.
Yeah.
And in closing too, I just want to honor our mothers. My mother is also, every morning when I come out, I'm living with my family right now as I've been dealing with a lot of illness and health stuff the last year and a half. And every morning when I walk out in the living room super early, it's dead silent out here. And my mom's under her blanket with candles lit and her prayer book's out in front of her. And she's just sometimes weeping just silently or smiling or singing hymns under her breath and just sitting out here for like 2 hours at 5 a.m. And I didn't acknowledge that when I was young. It seemed so ridiculous, and I rebelled against it so much. And now through your eyes and your book, and now every morning when I come out here, it's like an honor to behold. And I'm so quiet. I don't want to disturb it when I'm getting my tea or my coffee. And I just want to honor your mother and my mother and your grandmother who you wrote about on that page, and the ancestors that are breathing us forward and have woven these prayers that are under our feet.
Beautiful.
Do you have any final words for the people?
My final word is just to be quiet and let the resonance rise to the surface. Like what's been said, what is here, what is moving through. Let it have a soft place to land by settling into quiet. So if we can end with the way we started, those 3 to 5 breaths.
Please.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Octavia. Such an honor.